Hello, welcome to Quackalope. Thank you for being here. I'm bringing you a before you back on Lords of Ragnarok by Awaken Realms, which is down to the last 24 hours over on Gamefound. Link, as always, in the top video of the top description of this video. Swing over there, take a look. There's been new creatures added, new monsters added, expansions, a 5th player expansion, and a solo module by a fairly successful and popular designer. So you should swing over there and take a closer look. But this is a new series that we're running with, my hope, every Kickstarter we do coverage on from now into perpetuity. I think that's a word. Where we break down a few important factors that you should be aware of or you should analyze before you decide to back. So this is going to be a conversation. We're going to start with why you should care, swing into an overview of the game, talk about the theme, look at the core mechanics and how it implements them here on the table, discuss the best and the worst elements of Lords of Ragnarok, and then talk about changes I'd still like to see, or things that I'd like to see as the game gets developed and ends up in your hands one day. So if you're brand new to Quackalope, hit the subscribe button down below. If you've seen 1, 2, or 17 of our videos, we're going to be doing more and more series-based content, and so we'd love for you to be able to stay tuned and see everything that we put out. And to start with, let's talk about why you should be interested in Lords of Ragnarok. Well, first off, the obvious thing is it's going to be following on the heels of Lords of Hellas. This is a standalone area control skirmish game in that same universe where you have variable paths to victory from completing certain territory control objectives, hunting creatures and monsters, and here in Lords of Ragnarok, they switch things up a little bit with a escalating endgame condition that deals with, well, meteors falling down into the center and you trying to position yourself around that region. This is coming from a publisher who has mind-blowingly been successful at a lot of projects with, I think, 2 or 3 games in the top 100 of all time, and Lords of Hellas being one that is right there on the heels of one of the most popular game franchises in the industry. Awaken Realms is known for insane miniatures games, really high-quality components and upgrades and items, along with games that are expansive and continually invite players to dig in time and time again. So this is a safe back, this is from a known publisher, and this is a reiteration or reimplementation of a game that was widely successful with the audience that liked it. So that's why you should be interested in Lords of Ragnarok. Now, before we get to the overview, I do want to make sure that I announce any disclosures. Since we're doing this series on every Kickstarter Gamefound project we work with, I do take, from time to time, some sponsored gameplay content or previews, and so I want to make sure I give you, the audience, a fair accounting of my relationship. I've done a lot of work with Awaken Realms, but this is going to be the first project where I've had any sponsored content at all. We enjoyed the game quite a lot, so I went back to them and asked them to sponsor a gameplay video that we released towards the beginning of the campaign. So, as far as that's concerned, take that into account as I continue breaking down my favorite and least favorite or best and worst elements of the title. So let's talk about an overview of Lords of Ragnarok. Lords of Ragnarok is going to be a game that is all about giant escalating forces, territory control, and slowly powering up your personalized character or hero, in this case Viking, to become more and more powerful and drive towards one of any variable number of win conditions. Those win conditions are going to be as such: control all regions in 3 full lands, being the colored icons and locations. Oh, and that's supposed to happen. These miniatures are modular. You'll be constructing them as you play the game. So excuse the fact that I just knocked that one down in the process. It is part of the charm of the game until I do something like that. Control all 5 regions with temples, which are going to be these little icons here that are built up. Kill 2 monsters, and then take down Loki, which is going to be the monster hunting portion of victory, or Ragnarok, which is going to trigger when any series of potential endgame drivers cause Ragnarok to trigger, which means you need to control as many regions, or the most regions, around the point of Ragnarok, which is the second or the central point here in the game. So that's what you're aiming for. Now, how do you actually get there? You'll all be playing with modular characters with their own titles and special abilities and starting units, and their own personality traits or upgrades and mechanics. After you've selected your characters, you'll start exploring the board, picking up runes, going to locations, creating affinities with different regions on the board to start gaining escalating powers. Every turn you'll go here to the center area, placing down one of your item markers or one of your action markers to take an action on the board. That could be fighting a monster, movement, slowly upgrading and preparing for another turn, or leveling up and gaining status on your board. That's going to be your main beginning objective. Start controlling regions, start powering up your own personal player characters, and get as many of your troops down onto the table as possible so you can pursue one of those 4 different win conditions or strategies. As you dive into the game, you'll also be constructing and building various different monuments, which are all modular, and if I can pull it correctly, all start to break apart. As the game progresses, you'll be adding piece to piece and also placing priests down, which will give you in-game bonuses and begin escalating or continuing to grow your personal player hero. Everyone starts becoming a little bit more asymmetric as the game progresses and as they pursue their various win conditions until you come down to a crescendo of sorts. Usually there'll be multiple players that are all driving for that end-game victory condition, and it'll come down to the wire of who's able to defeat Loki first or who triggers Ragnarok, putting themselves in a winning position. This is a tight-knit board with a lot of direct area control, a lot of direct conflict, and some interesting combat and hunt mechanics. When you go on a hunt, you'll be doing your best to hit various locations on these creatures, each of which has their own personality traits. You'll also potentially be befriending or taking control of various creatures that your opponents might be hunting, moving them around the board, causing damage, wreaking havoc, and playing their hunt cards or their monster cards when you go to battle. When someone attacks, they'll play a series of combat cards down onto the board, and you'll respond with monster attack cards. Those monster cards are going to give you control over how they inflict damage, and your attack cards, your combat cards, will be required or specialized to hit certain locations on those monsters. So, that's the main overview of the game. There's still some small details like the boats that allow you to move around the outside of the map or the artifacts that you get for controlling certain specific regions or taking down certain creatures, but they provide more in-game and mid-game bonuses. There's also blessing cards that you draft twice throughout the course of the game at the moment, and those also give you some degree of asymmetry between your players, the actions you can take and the options you have on the table. So with that being said, let's swing over into the theme. The theme of Lords of Ragnarok is going to be similar to that of Lords of Hellas. Hellas placed you in Greco-Roman times with steampunk type of manufacturing and agriculture and giant war machines clashing head-to-head. Well, do that, the steampunk universe of an ancient civilization that's developed, and place it down here in a Viking world with mythology, lore, and where the gods really are alive. Awaken Realms always does a remarkable job at putting in flavor and elements, details into the miniatures, cool abilities with every one of your characters, and beautiful artwork when it comes to the creatures that you're engaging with and the monsters that you're fighting. The thematic overtones here are very solid, and when it comes down to the gameplay, this does feel like a helter-skelter skirmish game where Viking troops are able to sail around the edge and the borders of the land, jumping off onto the shore and slaughtering everything in their wake, or they can pray to the gods and take advantage of certain malicious tendencies that some of their deities have, moving creatures into regions, wreaking havoc by having control or an affinity with different locations, and of course, upgrading and taking advantage of some special powers and abilities along the way. There's a lot to love here. If you're a Viking fan, if you're a steampunk fan, this really does set a great thematic overtone with vibrant artwork, good narrative, and events and triggers that feel appropriate to the region and times. Now that being said, ultimately this is just a piecemeal helter-skelter skirmish game. The thematic elements of it don't necessarily drive every mechanic element of the game. You're still playing in a very similar fashion to that of Lords of Hellas, meaning that you're still taking actions, leveling up heroes, and going on amazing adventures, but it doesn't necessarily have to be Viking. in order for it to be fun or good. So if you don't like Viking, there might still be a reason to explore it, but if you're really looking for a game that makes it feel like you're playing Viking characters, I'd say Lords of Ragnarok gives you a really great aesthetic, but doesn't necessarily feel uniquely Viking in origin, with the exception, of course, of some of the boat mechanics and potentially the fact that it's a little bit more head-to-head skirmish than its predecessor was. Swinging from there, down to the core mechanics. So the core mechanics for me in this game are going to be broken into 3 parts. I believe one of the core mechanics is going to be area control, the next is going to be asymmetric player powers, and then finally, I want a chance to talk about the skirmish element of Lords of Ragnarok, because I really do think this is a more heavily skirmish-featured game than its predecessor, Lords of Hellas, was. So starting with the nature of area control, ultimately that's what you're playing here. A majority of your win conditions are going to be built off of the idea of taking control of specific regions. You have regions, or lands, you have shrines, and then you have the area around Ragnarok. You're going to be fighting head-to-head for all of these locations throughout the course of the game, pushing back against monsters and against your opponents and enemies. Along with that, if you take specific locations, you'll be able to gain specific runes, create affinities or pacts with different locations and regions, and get extra bonuses or extra item cards and resources from taking control of the locations with your giant statues and pyramids. This game is ultimately an area control game. Now, if you like area control, it does a few things that I think are unique. It is a tight board where you don't really ever lock down one specific zone. You certainly can have a stranglehold on it, but due to the limited number of armies that you have, or units that you can move around the board, it is a little bit harder to be guaranteed to control a zone for the entirety of the game. You might, but if someone wants to, they could spawn, produce, sail around the edge of the board, and still show up at your back door and do their very best to steal or take down power from you. It also, in my experience, has been very difficult to win skirmish or area control specific objectives. You usually are struggling to that final decision point. You're usually fighting and squabbling, and people are paying attention to the board and always able to cut in or take advantage of a weak spot. So this game has a lot to do with spreading and tactically planning when and where you want to make your move. Now, your move may be a collection or a summation of a variety of different actions where you start spending cards that allow you to move farther, you start taking advantage of one of your actions on the board, or you control a monster that's able to go disrupt an army that's about to close in at your gate. But overall, it is a fairly classic area control game. I don't know that it does anything directly unique in the nature of area control, but I think the combination that it has with the skirmish element really does make this game very charming and much more right for me. You see, when I personally approach area control games, I'm always looking for something that isn't by nature area control. I love Blood Rage, for instance, because of the drafting cycle in it. And Cyclades didn't quite work for me because the cards were less interesting than the area control mechanic on the board. Well, Lords of Ragnarok takes that and adds skirmish elements into the game. In Lords of Hellas, I always went Munster Strat because it was the weird thing. The area control of that game specifically never really was my favorite part. But here, we get to fight, take control of creatures, and really mash heads against each other. I find that you end up in a lot more combat, or at least the threat of combat, a lot more often in this game than I have in its predecessor or a lot of the other area control games I've played. Personally, I really like that. So the skirmish nature of this game, what starts emphasizing or building up the skirmish? Well, first off, taking control of creatures has been easier and more beneficial than ever before in a title like this. You're going to be incentivized to start creating affinities and packs with various different beasts around the board. They're going to do their movement. They're not going to affect you, and you're going to be able to decide how they start moving around the board. So you, in a way, control them. They get added to your squadron until someone steals their affinity or takes them out and battles them to the bitter end. It really, really changes up the nature of play. Along with that, because this is an area control game that has so much regionality, the skirmish element is really highlighted. These boats here allow you to move around any adjacent connected region, meaning everyone is usually within 1 or 2 spawn points or movement points of everyone else. Not only that, the other major thing is that you can also spawn your troops according to where your boat is. That changes the game, because instead of moving troops from one side of the board all the way over to another, all I need to do is sail around the outer edge and drop off a brand new unit, meaning I can engage in combat with someone who's left a weak spot as quickly as a turn or two. The other elements of Skirmish here that are really fun and really engaging are going to be the nature of leveling up and growing your own personal player board. As you start drafting these blessing cards, you'll get different bonuses that allow you to manipulate the rules in some form, whether they incentivize you to hunt creatures, give you bonuses for taking out your enemy, or allow you to sacrifice but keep troops on the board during critical moments. You'll get a lot of fun control that encourages you to experiment and continue butting heads. And then finally, the players themselves have some special abilities that usually twist the game in one fashion or another. Like, for instance, Snorri here, the Scald. Army in a land with Snorri do not lose its strength when it is stomped by a monster and for losing a battle. Meaning, you can go to war, you can fight without being scared of losing and losing your army along the way. Finally, the other cool thing about area control and skirmish in this game is going to be the nature of how these troops work. They have dials around the bottom, which are going to control the total capacity of troops here on the board. As those dials start spinning and you start racking up more and more armies, you're going to be hitting and butting heads. As you do that, you'll add those numbers up, and then you'll add combat cards to whatever fight stat you have. These cards are used to specifically hunt monsters, but also take out your opponents, debuffing them, adding your strength, allowing you to play multiple cards with things like arrows and extra shots. But it's a critical point where you have to decide how many of those resources that are hard to get you use versus what do you save for fighting creatures or your own defense at a later time. For me, this is an area control skirmish game, and that alone makes it a lot better for me. If it was just straight area control where positioning and tactics was the entire point and heart of the game, I think a lot of people would love it. But it's not that. This is where positioning and tactics come to play, and you always have the threat of war right on the edges of your border. So, the last thing I want to talk about is asymmetric player powers. This isn't necessarily a core mechanic, but it is an important thing to note. One of the most fun things about a game like Lords of Hellas or Lords of Ragnarok is re-exploring the same map, the same environment, with some asymmetry mixed in. The different characters and creatures that you're able to play as really do add a nice variability and puzzle to the game. They change the strategy that you should technically approach when playing or engaging with a scenario. And depending on who has who on the board, you really have to pay attention to who has what powers and what attachments or bonuses they've added to them. The asymmetry here is maybe not as deep as I would like it to go in the current prototype that I have, but I still do find it is fun to re-explore and re-examine how different characters can operate and engage with one another. Along with that, getting things like relics or bonuses, getting affinities on the board that give you a benefit every time someone takes an action or every time someone takes an action for the first time, and of course, spreading and keeping your blessing cards create a unique playing environment and experience. My characters can feel the same if I choose to go down the same strategy and I start buffing them in the same way, but if I'm open to the way that the game directs my play and really start thinking on my feet and exploring what the characters can do, I find that there's a lot of different ways to play and a lot of different strategic and tactical choices built around the idea of these characters being different. I've seen players run across the board creating affinities with every single location, so they're constantly getting reinforcements and bonuses. I've seen players drive endgame by building all of these monuments, making sure they're buffing themselves and then hunting creatures along the way. I've seen players just go for Ragnarok, positioning themselves towards the center, hoping, above all grace, that these cards will trigger before someone else finishes their main objective. And I've seen that work, and I've seen it fail. You always have to be ready to adapt, think on your feet, and of course, find a plan, strategy, or tunnel you're going to narrow down into. So those are the core mechanics. Now let's talk about what I like the most and the least about Lords of Ragnarok. Well, what I like most about the game is going to be echoing back into the theme and the skirmish elements here. I do really like Viking-themed games, and I feel like this one does a really good job. It doesn't hurt that Awaken Realms creates beautiful products, and these Sundrop miniatures are amazing to have on the table. But I like playing with characters that I'm familiar with. A bit of lore, a bit of flavor. I like having creatures that I know the theme of, and seeing the reimagination of this environment in a steampunk mentality has always been fun and pleasurable to sit down with. When I get a final production copy in, if there's a art or lore book or any story at all, I'm going to be diving into that. I'd love to see a version of the solo that gave me a little bit more of a narrative to play against, because this environment is so captivating and compelling. Along with that, I really like how the action selection track works. Now, it can be a little bit harder to see because it's placed here on the center of the board, but it really does change the game. You see, as players take actions, you'll be placing on top of other players' chips, giving them a bonus for whatever action they've taken earlier than you. This makes a really nice back and forth, where everyone's paying attention to the center part of the game state, and everyone's wondering what other players are going to take, because it gives me a bonus mid-game. I love games that give me an excuse to pay attention to what my opponents are doing, and incentivize or keep me engaged when it's not my turn. Lords of Ragnarok does that really well. And finally, I was going to tell you about the skirmish element of the game. I like that this game can be head-to-head, cutthroat, fight to the bitter end, but it doesn't have to be. This could be a more classic area control game, but it always has that overwhelming threat or presence of skirmish on the board, similar to Scythe in some ways. And for me, I love that the threat just exists. I know someone could sail around. When I see them move their ship or position an army tactically close to me, I start asking myself, are they just holding down that region, or are they doing their very best to, well, get close to me so that they can make a tactical play soon? And I, of course, have to decide to continue burrowing into my strategy or adapting to respond and answer their threat. So, what do I like the least about Lords of Ragnarok? Well, right now, with the prototype that we have, I did find that some of the iconography and some of the display points on the game were really, really hard to track. This center zone here was hard to read, and the iconography, while learnable, was something that I kept checking even into Game 3 and 4. I was never fully comfortable with how, I guess, everything laid out. Along with that, some of the scenarios that drove Ragnarok to completion were way too easy to solve. I found that if you're playing a 3 or 4 player game, the odds of Ragnarok hitting with certain layouts of cards was almost guaranteed, because most of the objectives deal with some variation on the core win objectives, or various strategies towards win condition. And Ragnarok, while it is interesting and can be fun to see from time to time, I really want it to be a thing that maybe happens when someone purposefully causes it to happen, or happens 1 out of every 5 games when the game's gone on a little bit longer than players want. It feels like an endgame trigger that maybe wasn't fully thought out yet. And I've even went as far as planning and prepping what some of those cards have been in order to prevent Ragnarok triggering way too early in an experience. Along with that, I do feel like there's a lot of opportunities for more theme to be added to the title. I'd love to see more art and lore around the monsters specifically, and I miss the hit locations that they had in the original. Now, I'm not sure if they're adding this in, because this is a prototype, but if they aren't, I really will be disappointed that I can't target and hit specific weak points on a creature. Instead, I'm just fighting a bottom row standard kind of iconography bin. And the blessing cards. The blessing cards in Lords of Hellas were maybe one of the best parts of the game. You get powers and abilities, you upgrade and escalate, and it always feels great to trigger that draft and send it around the table. Well, here, we only have 2 draft stages. I wish that was at least 3, because you're taking away one of the most fun variable parts of the game, the asymmetric player powers, the ability to customize a strategy, and you're giving me less of it. I don't want that. I want more, or at least the same amount, if anything. So those are going to be my least favorite parts of Lords of Ragnarok, and now here, let's talk about stuff that I would like to see, which we've already gone over a touch, but things that I'd like to see between where the game is as a prototype and what the game's going to be in its final stages as it gets to you. Now, I know they've added a 5th player expansion and they have a solo mode as well. Personally, I'd really like that solo mode to be a little bit more narrative focused than mechanics driven. I want to feel like I'm exploring the environment and maybe discovering the creatures and the monsters that we're going head to head here against. Will that happen? I'm not entirely sure. I never played the solo mode for Lords of Hellas, and so I can't speak to what they've done in the past, but it would be what I'd be looking for in a solo mode in this environment. Area control, pitted or pinioned against specific objectives. Have me trigger Ragnarok. Have me build certain temples. Have me fight and take down certain creatures. Give me this puzzle, but let me go on a little bit of a journey as I play through it. Along with that, I would like to see an extra blessing round, which we already talked about. Give me more powers and abilities. Don't take them away from me. And I really need the iconography to be redesigned to some degree in order to make usability easier. Outside of that, I don't know that there's a lot of things, or at least core elements, that I'd be looking for. The game plays fast and quick, and it really is a rewarding experience. I don't know if it's a perfect game for myself, but I think a lot of people are really going to love what they're presented with. And for me, this is better than the original Lords of Hellas. If I have to choose between the two, I will be keeping Lords of Ragnarok and getting rid of the original. But I don't know that I have to choose between the two. I don't know that it's a head-to-head pick. If you loved Lords of Hellas, this still does a lot of those things. But I don't know that it replaces the more tactical armies across the map type of approach that Lords of Hellas took. Instead, here, like I've said time and time again, this is an iron fist to a temple. This is a gauntlet. This is a battle arena. This is a skirmish game. And I really like that about it. I ultimately want to feel more powerful. I want more abilities, I want more characters to play with, and I want more reason to build these monuments faster and quicker. I guess one of my biggest complaints between the two games is that the odds of actually getting these constructed is so low. The statues are incredible and they're fun to show your friends, but honestly, you don't have them on the board until the very end of the game, and even then, it's usually only 1 or 2. In this game, building these statues doesn't In this game, building these statues isn't necessary for win condition. So I honestly wonder if we could do it in the opposite way. Tear them down, rip pieces off of them instead of building them up. That way, for the majority of the game, we'll have incredible miniatures, and as we go to war, fight, and battle, we'll start seeing them crumble. It's not thematic in the sense of worshipping and raising up a deity, but it would at least let me see and take pleasure in, well, the board game that I have. So there we have it. We have 24 hours left. This is Lords of Ragnarok. Hopefully you're enjoying this idea for a series. Before You Back is something that we've been thinking about for a long time, and I want to narrow down into. I want to know what you want to pay attention to, the things that you'd like insight on, and give you as much information as possible so you can make a good decision around what games are going to be right and wrong for you. Because ultimately, a game like this is, if it's right for you, an incredible investment. But it ties up your money for about a year or two if it's not one that you're going to be interested in. I still think it's a safe bet no matter what, but if I can encourage a few of you to buckle down and go ahead and order it, you'll get it at a better price than you would in an alternative fashion, along with promos, extras, and bonuses. And if there's 3 or 4 of you that were watching this just to see if you should keep or back out of your pledge, and I've helped you make that decision, I've done my job. So, whatever the case, whatever you do, remember to do the important thing, get out and play some games, and I'll see you next time. Thank you.